Thank you very much, Judy and Patricia. So I'll ask the panelists to respond. We'll start with you, Paul, and then Nancy.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, the Ecuador idea. I think there is some scope for this sort of approach of leaving assets in the ground. I should say, quite generally, unless all the links in the chain hold, the natural assets are better left in the ground. And so, one way I would like to see the Natural Resource Charter or something like it develop is as of a in a way a test for complicity in plunder. Because if that chain does not hold, then the exploitation of natural assets will lead to one or other form of plunder. And so participating in the extraction of natural assets when the chain doesn't hold is complicity in plunder. And so I would like to see that emerge gradually, in effect, as a new way of getting an international convention from the bottom up, which then holds to account the private actors in resource extraction. It's not enough, to my mind, to have to say, well, we've got legal authority from the government. If this chain is clearly broken, then the government is reneging on its obligations as a custodial agent of defending the future or defending the many from the few. One area in which the Equator type of approach could be generalized is coal, and the problem of carbon emissions. That there's a lot of unexploited coal in low-income countries. In effect, now we understand the damage done by carbon emissions. The social value of that coal has collapsed, and so there's a tension between the returns to the nation and the returns to the global community. And it's probably not a bad idea to think in terms of some compensation from the global community to the nation to leave the coal in the ground. So that would be a sort of generalization from the Ecuador case. There are some obvious difficulties in working out what is a reasonable payment, annual payment, and there's also difficulties in credible commitment to that payment. But those difficulties might not be insurmountable because, after all, if the payments stopped, the country could always just dig the stuff up. So I think it's an interesting idea. Your second question was about increased regional autonomy. And I've got ambiguous feelings here. I mean, Nancy's point about if only you distribute, distribution to households is the sort of limiting case of distribution to regions. If you split regions up small enough, you get to households. And there's some big advantages in that. There are some disadvantages. In Nigeria, where you've got half the money distributed to the states, to the 36 states, there are two disadvantages. One is that the level of scrutiny at the level of the state is even weaker than the scrutiny at the level of the federation. So, for example, you have a federal level competitive procurement requirement, and you have a federal level fiscal responsibility requirement. Only 7 of the 36 states have passed a Fiscal Responsibility Act applying to their state, and none have passed a competitive procurement act. So decentralizing can be actually a movement to worse governance. The other problem with decentralizing is that, and this is reflected in Nigeria to a bizarre extent. I said 36 states share the money, but actually only 35, because there's one state which doesn't get any of the oil money, and that is Lagos. Yeah? And the argument there is, Lagos has already got tax revenues from activities in Lagos, so why give it the oil money? And the answer why it should get the oil money is that Lagos is already half of the non-oil economy of Nigeria. Already. When the oil runs out, Nigeria's future economy is going to be predominantly in Lagos. And so in building the future of the Nigerian economy, most of the investment of the oil money needs to take place in Lagos and its surrounds. At the moment, the distribution system immaculately denies any investment of the oil money in the state which is actually Nigeria's future. And of course, the future won't just be benefiting the children of the people who are currently living in Lagos. Around Nigeria, future children are going to move to Lagos. Yeah? So it's going to become a megacity. So that's the problem with autonomy, that you sort of freeze the allocation. Just have the power to tax locally. And he said, I noticed that the more corrupt the governor, the lower was the local taxation. That basically, they decided to forgo the small revenues from local taxation in order to get away, to escape scrutiny. So that was kind of clearly very much in the spirit of what Nancy was saying. What international interventions can help in Nigeria? Let me close with an example of what I think is probably one of the most powerful international interventions that Nigeria has ever benefited from. And it was completely inadvertent. I mean, this is the neat thing, that we didn't even mean to help Nigeria. And it was the fallout from 9/11, and it was the Financial Action Task Force, which was a very non-representative task force put together to try and prevent the financing of terrorism. And it just produced a list of countries, not countries which were financing terrorism, but countries where the financial system was not sufficiently robust to be able to ensure that terrorism wasn't being financed. And Nigeria was on that list. And President Obasanjo, previous president, to his considerable credit, his mission in life was to try and restore Nigeria's reputation. That was what he wanted as a legacy. And so he said, whatever else happens, we've got to get ourselves off this list. And so he got through the legislation to create a unit which is called the Economic and Financial Crimes Unit to prosecute crooks in Nigeria. And the head of that unit was a friend of mine, Nuhu Ribadu, and Nuhu then decided a fish rots from the head, and so he went for the big fish, and he arrested the president of the Senate. To my mind, it's probably the most fun thing he did was to jail his own boss, the Inspector General of Police, who he discovered had, I believe, $150 million carefully saved from his salary. So there's an example of where an international standard that we didn't even mean to help Nigeria actually empowered this financial action, this Economic and Financial Crimes Unit. And Nuhu told me, he said, my power came entirely from this international standard and the need to get Nigeria to meet this standard. So my closing remark is, if we can be that useful with international standards when we didn't even mean to, think what we could do if we actually tried.
Nice questions. On the Ecuador president's suggestion, my guess is that what he's talking about is protecting the forests, and there's now lots of interest because of climate change in protecting the forest. So he's feeding right into what was discussed. That's one of the good things about Copenhagen, that adding to the Kyoto Protocol, that the idea was on the table that forests are worth protecting and being paid for. So I think, absolutely, even if there weren't forests, if you could get the international community to pay a country that is in a premature state. It's not Norway. It's not the UK. It's in a premature stage. It's an immature system. Then I think it's you could go on and on sort of about optimality and the rate of extraction of the rent relative to the interest rate. But frankly, I think this is a satisficing issue from a development point of view. So I like the idea very much. And if in addition to protecting the forests, it avoids some conflict, that's a byproduct. That's a happy byproduct. It is interesting that, just going back to Paul's 5 decision points, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative addresses 2 of them, I would say. It doesn't deal with the question that President Morales is raising. I think of it as he's calling the bluff of the global community. And so let's see what happens. I hope that it works, frankly, and that the international community doesn't back off, because there's a lot of talk about, the donors doing good things. In fact, building on what the point Paul made on climate change and the coal, I'm worried that we're building up a lot of political resistance in this country. We should be prepared in our own interest to pay the Chinese to leave the coal in the ground. We should be prepared to subsidize tremendously their closing down coal plants when they're politically ready to do that, even though those plants commercially, if you don't take into account the social costs of the pollution, would still have a viable life. But it's very worrisome, frankly. So this idea that there's a logic in our global self-interest to taking steps, I hope more and more ideas like those that you referred to are put on the table. The question Patricia asked about autonomy of local citizens, she put it as over management of the assets. And I think, Paul, you interpret it as over control of the rents.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
And I'm not sure exactly what Patricia had in mind, but again, I would say yes. As with so many issues, that it's easier to imagine accountability when it's a more local process. But I wouldn't agree that you want to have all the rents or all the income accrue at the local level, for all the reasons that Paul raised. Then Judy asked about the international community, how could it intervene? And I think Paul actually covered the issue beautifully. There is, in the last 10 years, the EITI, the Kimberley process on the blood diamonds, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have some papers on our website about the failure to enforce that. International arbitration, if that ex-ante building into legal contracts, international arbitration that would be monitored, that would help governments. That would be a kind of commitment technology for weak governments. Nuhu Ribadu right now is a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development, and he's writing a report about the Financial Action Task Force. The thing that I wanted to mention is that he's not in Nigeria.
He's actually wanted in Nigeria.
He's wanted
you're harboring a criminal.
So
I was harboring the criminal.
You were too, yes. I think that's right. We both shared in helping to generate the global public good of having Nuhu Ribadu safe and writing. I just want to go back to the point that it isn't enough. This, information and disclosure, it just may not be sufficient. I think we have to be more creative. And we have to hope, even in the case of Ghana, even if 2/3 of the expected permanent revenue stream, 2/3 has been already allocated. But let's work on minimizing the risk that the other 1/3 are not invested or spent well for the benefit of the people of Ghana by pushing hard now. We're also looking at the idea of direct distribution in Papua New Guinea. There's a group in Bolivia that's been thinking about this for several years, held numerous fora. So it is not an easy idea to push within a particular country. There needs to be kind of the sort of moral suasion that the United Nations can bring, that the international community can bring, civil society can bring. And then there needs to be the recognition that even if something like that were to get started in a country, it won't be sustainable in the beginning. It will need some sort of enforcement, I believe, from outside.
Thank you very much. We've had a number of questions and that address the point that you've made. There's two broad questions for you, Paul. The first is that a lot of your discussion mentioned the actions of governments in plundering natural resources. What about instances where the plunderers come from outside the national borders? Could you comment on this, and particularly in the context of your 5 points? The second broad question for you, relates to governance. A lot of the success of the critical mass is dependent on their relationship with a strong and capable government. What practical solutions could you offer for countries that have long histories of weak governance? And what have we learned, or what do we need to learn about measures to facilitate the emergence of capable governments in such countries? Two broad questions for you, Nancy. The first relates to direct distribution. Surprise, surprise. A number of questioners have mentioned the fact that financial systems in most of these countries are very weak and fragile. And so how do you ensure effective and efficient distribution? That's one. And are you worried that this would actually lead to productive expenditures within these countries? Could it become counterproductive in some way? The second broad question relates to responsible intervention. A couple of questioners are a little worried that the development community and the donors are yet to demonstrate sustained interest or effectiveness. And so how would they be interested in responsible intervention in your model? I think we'll go with you first, Paul, and then Nancy.
Yeah. Okay, fine. So the first question was about the plunder coming from outside the country. And the obvious foreign participants in plunder are the resource extraction companies. And what I try to sketch, not in the talk, but in my remarks subsequently, is that this notion of complicity, that I would like to get to a state in which there was an international convention which kind of established what constituted the conditions under which plunder could be avoided, which is basically this decision chain being in place, and which then different organizations rated different aspects of the decision chain so that you could tell whether a country, in a particular country, the decision chain held or not. And then resource extraction companies that participated in resource extraction where the chain was broken would be deemed to be complicit in one or other of these forms of plunder. I think that the concept of plunder needs to be rooted in this one or other of these notions that I've given, the stealing by the few from the many, or the stealing by the present from the future. Now, because of that stealing of the present from the future, it's not enough for the resource extraction company to say that we're perfectly legally, we've got a legal agreement with the government, we're paying money to the government. If the government is spending that money only on consumption, then it's a plunder of the future. Plunder by the few of the many is kind of easier to see that it stings. If the Minister of Mines is sticking all the money in foreign bank accounts, then resource extraction companies are obviously complicit. That wouldn't be controversial. Okay? It's the plunder of the future which is kind of more controversial. But I think ethically we have to recognize that natural assets and natural liabilities are not things that belong to us, the present generation. The future has rights too. If you don't believe that, then the whole climate change agenda becomes kind of unintelligible. Because with climate change, it's that we don't have the rights to run up future liabilities. That is the sort of ethical foundation for the whole of action against climate change in my mind.
Sorry, before you move on,
yeah.
Could you comment on the issue of militias crossing borders?
Well, that's in a way that's a very clear-cut case of plunder through violence, isn't it? I mean, and of course it's rife. I was just talking to one of your Sierra Leonean colleagues who was saying, "Well, I'm very worried about. I better not say which neighbour, right? So yes, let me say one final thing about foreign companies, which is that I think a good institutional device for reducing the scope for foreign companies to plunder is to sell resource extraction rights through auctions. And I would like to see the auctions internationally verified as being up to standard. I think auctions are a very good way of leveling the playing field. There's an asymmetry of information between the government and the companies. The companies have much better information on what the asset is worth. And the way to get round that asymmetry of information is to make companies compete against each other so that inadvertently they reveal true value. And that's what a properly conducted auction does. How do you build a sort of strong and capable government? Well, first of all, let's get real. In a lot of these environments, as you say, you don't have a strong and capable government. Building a strong and capable government takes years. Now, one implication may be that you go rather gently on resource extraction. That might be one implication, that you leave some of the stuff in the ground. What else can you do? First, and this is the key thing of the resource charter, is if most things are not going to work very well, make sure you get the key things right. And that's why I keep emphasizing the critical decisions, the chain of absolutely essential things that have to be got right. The tax system has to be got right. The savings decision has to be got right. Building the capacity to invest domestically has to be done. Without that, avoiding the Niger Delta has to be done. Otherwise, far from harnessing these assets for building prosperity, you risk the opposite. So that's one. Focus on the few things that really matter. Second thing is use the role models of other countries that have successfully gone through transformation from poverty to prosperity. And there are lots of them now. After all, most countries in the world have gone through that process by now. Right? The countries that are still stuck at the bottom are actually now a minority. Right? And so there are lots of examples of countries which over the last 30 years have gone through a rapid development process. Mike Spencer's little report, the Growth Commission, just tried to extract what have the 13 countries that had sustained a generation of very fast growth got in common. And that's a sensible start. Right? It's also a sensible way, I think, to guide investment selection. The Rolls-Royce version of investment selection is cost-benefit analysis. These countries haven't got the skill base within the civil service to do cost-benefit analysis. So a much quicker and politically easier way is to say, well, let's just look at what some other countries that have been through this process, what did they prioritize? And you can't go too far wrong if you follow a success model. Third idea and final idea is that I think a lot of countries, really poor countries, have locked themselves into the imitation of the Europe of the 1950s. The Europe of the 1950s was a very peculiar time. It had just come out of Second World War. There's a lot of national spirit. The war machine in Britain had been a very effective state enterprise. You got a lot of public spiritedness within the public sector. And so the public sector worked well. And so the idea that you would deliver public services through a national health service, through a national education ministry, this was a good idea, and it worked in 1950s Britain. Right? It still works in Scandinavia. It doesn't work any longer in Britain, but it still works in Scandinavia. But Scandinavia is bloody peculiar, right? It's wonderful. If you can turn Sierra Leone into Scandinavia, do it, right? If you could turn Britain into Scandinavia, right, do it, right? But get real, we can't, right? And so trying to imitate that European model of the 1950s, which Africa has done for 50 years and kept failing, unsurprisingly, because it's so demanding. It was such a peculiar set of circumstances. I think it's time to move on and say, what other ways are there in which government can ensure good basic service delivery, can spend money well? What architecture would be appropriate for context? And in an environment like Sierra Leone, it won't be a monopoly Ministry of Health doing everything and a monopoly Ministry of Education doing everything. Nor will it be the total bypass, which the donors are doing at the moment, let's fund UNICEF and the NGOs, right? But you need some architecture which, to my mind, combines decentralized service delivery at the bottom, where you use whatever you can find, social enterprise, NGOs, local communities, whatever. But centralized funding of those services at the top, within the public sector. And that architecture has been unexplored territory because African governments have kept this sort of holy grail of Europe of the 1950s, and the donors just keep doing the same damn thing time and again. So developing an architecture of institutions which works in context, liberating yourselves from the imitation of the colonial inheritance. That would be my final suggestion.
Thank you very much. Nancy?
I do want to say something that I think is the big sort of central issue is the question about plunder from the outside. What can the outside world do to advance development, reduce plunder, but in the broader sense, advance development? And I just did want to say that, as Paul has suggested, there is a lot more that could be done than it has been done so far, because we tend to have had in the development community, a very country-focused approach.
Yes.
You know, the World Bank and AID, they have country programs. So we do have at the center right now a task force looking at the question of whether is there a way for the international community would name regimes as odious that are either acquiring debt, but they're not using the resources to advance the cause of their own people, or are selling assets. The question, you know, it's come up about the Chinese in Sudan, for example, buying assets. Is there a way to, in a practical sense, to have in the courts, say in London and New York, certain arrangements? Let me go to the questions to me. First is, are the financial systems too weak and fragile? No. I mean, I don't think that the direct distribution needs to rely, honestly, on financial systems. You need to have the money go out through the banks, but I don't know. I was in Malawi in December, and unfortunately, they're still passing the cash to pay teachers, you know. So that's the way it's still done in a lot of developing countries. Every week, the cash comes out. That has to be addressed, but it's being addressed in more and more settings. So I don't think that's a fundamental barrier. We have in Honduras and Nicaragua that are very low-income countries, we have conditional cash transfer arrangements. The World Bank has been advocating poverty mapping. Most countries, Nigeria is an exception, actually have succeeded at least once in doing a census. So these are things that it's possible. It's possible. It might not happen right away, but it ought to be tried, and there will be some fits and starts. That's the position I would take.
Of course, there's a good reason why Nigeria is the country which didn't have
right, that's
oil.
many oil, right. Well, no, I think even before there were reasons of ethnic rivalries, before oil was a problem in itself. So that's a deeper, and I think, you know, let's hope there is a good census in 2010. I think there's a good possibility in many countries that there will be. Would it be counterproductive? No, absolutely not. I mean, I think I feel sort of like a Jeffersonian sometimes. The people know what to do with the money, frankly. There is this idea, well, if we distribute the resources to the people, it'll be like remittance income. They'll use it for consumption instead of investment. Well, of course. If you're really poor, consumption smoothing is a good thing to do. That is welfare enhancing. And a lot of what is sometimes called consumption by economists is anyway investment in children, in better nutrition, and so on. So I'm not worried about it being counterproductive at all if all the net income, all of it, went on a per capita basis to households. And I like the idea that some households who have children would get, on a per capita basis, more. It would be like trying to give children a vote, which I think would be a good thing in many countries. Give the mothers the right to vote, the extra votes for the children they have. We wouldn't have the bias that we have right now, at least in this country, that is penalizing children compared to old people in use of collective resources. That's another issue. There was a question, would the donors stick to monitoring enforcement of direct distribution of net income? Yeah, I think that it could be done. I would put it in the hands of a multilateral organization, not in the hands of a particular bilateral donor. But the donor's problem with fickleness and volatility is about the money coming from the capitals. This is not about money coming from the capitals. This is about money coming from the extraction and the sale of the natural resource. So I wouldn't associate the problem of donors' unpredictability and fickleness with the potential ability of the donor community, as with UN peacekeeping, to step in when it's endorsed, when it is the norm, and when a country's people ask for it.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Nancy. We have clearly not answered all the questions, but we have certainly advanced the argument some. And one thing that's clear from both Paul and Nancy is that there are a number of very good analyses and solutions, but each one is hostage to the weakest link problem, and that you need a number of things working at the same time to advance this agenda. We've also discussed a number of creative and innovative ways to reduce or eliminate plunder, and these include creation of a critical mass of informed people, direct distribution of resource rents, responsible intervention, paying to keep the resources in the ground when it's prudent to do so, reconnecting the state and its people, rethinking sovereignty, and the list goes on. We hope that this is a debate we would continue, and we look forward to a lot more research and collaboration in this area. Before we go, there's a few people who would like to recognize. This event is the brainchild of Julia Suni, who worked assiduously to make it happen. And join me in thanking her. And it's a collaboration between my center, the Center for Sustainable Economies, and the Jennings Randolph Fellowship Program. And we have Chantal Udrat, the Vice President, to thank for that. I'd also like to recognize both Michelle and Katie, who are in the back, for working so hard to make this happen, and also thank the people in the overflow rooms, particularly the participants in the ongoing Economics and Conflict course at the USIP Academy. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Paul and Nancy, once more.